Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/Bylinin_Sergey.html. The same book in other formats, http://royalib.com/book/bylinin_sergey/bitva_za_moskevu.html. Enjoy reading. Sergey Bylinin Battle for Moscow. Introduction. A participant in the Napoleonic Wars and military historian Karl Clausewitz back in the 19th century formulated one of the main theses of military affairs, the essence of which is as follows. The belligerent armies deliberately strive or are inevitably led by the development of hostilities to the main, general, battle. And if in this decisive battle neither side wins a convincing victory, then the further course of the war will be determined by other factors, time and reserves. In other words, the winner will be the one who is able and has time to prepare a greater number of shock reserves for the final crushing of the enemy. The First World War confirmed the validity of this thesis. Moreover, since by the beginning of the 20th century the methods and means of armed struggle had undergone serious changes compared to the times of Napoleon, many times greater efforts to mobilize the people and economic resources of the state became necessary to defeat the enemy. Literally, the transformation of the entire country into a single military camp and the organization of successive general strikes against the enemy, which, ultimately, lead to the exhaustion and collapse of his technical power and moral strength. Not just armies began to fight, but mobilized peoples, inspired by certain ideas. The National Socialist leadership of Germany, which came to power in 1933, was clearly aware of the limited resources of their country and its inability to wage a protracted war of attrition. Therefore, in its desire to bring Germany to the role of world leader, it relied on the doctrine of blitzkrieg or blitzkrieg wars and campaigns, and subsequently stubbornly adhered to this theory. By the mid-1930s, the development of new types of weapons, tanks, armored vehicles, combat aircraft, and communications equipment led to a sharp increase in the number of mobile motorized formations in the armies of the whole world. The old tactics of military operations, developed during the leisurely and positional First World War, underwent a decisive revision. The war of engines made it possible to quickly concentrate the main striking forces on narrow sections of the front, to achieve decisive superiority over the enemy there and, having broken his defenses, to rapidly develop a successful offensive. There was a real opportunity to quickly defeat the enemy's armed forces before he could carry out his mobilization plans and rely on innumerable resources and reserves. It was on this development of hostilities that the idea of the blitzkrieg was based, which the German generals successfully carried out in the first period of the Second World War. The battle near Moscow, which unfolded from the beginning of October and lasted until the end of 1941, put an end to this success. How he can carry out his mobilization plans and rely on incalculable resources and reserves. It was on this development of hostilities that the idea of the blitzkrieg was based, which the German generals successfully carried out in the first period of the Second World War. The battle near Moscow, which unfolded from the beginning of October and lasted until the end of 1941, put an end to this success. How he can carry out his mobilization plans and rely on incalculable resources and reserves. It was on this development of hostilities that the idea of the blitzkrieg was based, which the German generals successfully carried out in the first period of the Second World War. The battle near Moscow, which unfolded from the beginning of October and lasted until the end of 1941, put an end to this success. The Battle for Moscow, as one of the main events of the Second World War, has always attracted the interest of military historians with an unexpected turn in its development. The beginning of the battle turned into a disaster for the Soviet troops. Two fronts were defeated, 4 armies were surrounded. And it seemed that nothing could prevent the Germans from completing their victorious throw at Moscow. But suddenly, they suffer a resounding defeat, which was inevitably followed by the complete collapse of the fleeting campaign in the east. How and why did this happen? In this paper, the battle is considered from the point of view of the most important decisions of the German and Soviet high commands and front commands, which determined the course and result of the Moscow battle. We want to show the clash of military doctrines, designs and plans, the minds of the commanders of German military leaders, adherents of the German school of blitzkrieg, and Soviet military leaders, the heirs of the Russian military school. Tanks PZ, KPFW.3 and motorized infantry from the 11th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. Soviet-German Front, October 1941. Main events and decisions before the start of the Moscow battle. On December 18, 1940, Hitler approved Directive No. 21, the Barbarossa Plan. The highest German generals who developed it believed in the possibility of a quick destruction of the USSR. The strategic basis of the plan was the idea of a quick, blitzkrieg war lasting several weeks. With the strikes of three powerful groups, North, Center, and South, it was planned to encircle and destroy Soviet troops in the western regions of the country, capture Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, and quickly reach the final line, the Archangelsk-Volga line. Particular importance was attached to the capture of Moscow. It was supposed to be captured on the move by August 15, 1941, after reaching Smolensk. It was believed that with the fall of Moscow, the main political and military goals were achieved. By October 1, 1941, it was planned to end the war. Thus, the inevitability of a general battle in the 1941 campaign was laid down in the Barbarossa Plan. But it did not unfold in the operational environment that the German command assumed. Now, carried away by the disclosure of every possible truth about the war, they write a lot about the failures and losses of the 41st year, about constant encirclements, about panic and chaos, about tank pogroms and other big losses. But in this way there is a danger of not seeing the forest for the trees. Meanwhile, the complete destruction of Soviet troops in the western regions did not happen. Although the Red Army suffered heavy defeats and suffered huge losses, it did not lose its combat capability and continued to resist. By the beginning of August, neither Leningrad nor Kiev had been taken by the Germans, and fierce battles were unfolding in the western direction near Smolensk. The Wehrmacht also suffered significant losses. For the first 3 weeks of fighting, 92,000, and by the end of August 410,000 people and half of their tanks. Perhaps the numbers of our and German losses in that period are not comparable. However, as a result of the stubborn resistance of the Soviet troops, the initial advance of the Germans decreased from 30 to 40 kilometers to 5 to 6 kilometers per day. In the Moscow direction in the 2-month Battle of Smolensk, the troops of the Western Front, Marshal S. Timoshenko, of the front, having carried out a series of defensive and offensive operations, stopped the onslaught of Army Group Center, Field Marshal F. von Bock, at the turn of Yartsevo, Yelnya, Gum. The German generals, preparing an attack on Smolensk, believed that the Western Front was already exhausted and would not be able to restrain the advance of the German armies on Moscow. But the Soviet command managed to deploy, in fact, a new front, and behind it also the reserve. In August 1941, the situation on the Western Front stabilized. Von Bock did not have enough strength for a non-stop breakthrough to Moscow. Blitzkrieg, successfully working in Poland and in the West, stalled near Smolensk. For both warring parties, the moment has come to prepare for a general clash, which the battle for Moscow will soon become. The German leadership perceived the failure of the Barbarossa Plan with great concern. On August 4, 1941, Hitler convened a meeting of senior officers at the headquarters of the Center Group, Borisov. All the generals declared the need for an attack on Moscow. Especially zealous supporters of this plan were Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, and General Jodl, chief of staff of the OKH, High Command of the Ground Forces. German tank PZ, KPFW.4 unmotorized infantry landing from the 11th Panzer Division. October 1941. But Hitler hesitated. He wanted to first get the industrial regions of Ukraine, take possession of the Crimea as a springboard for the import of Romanian oil, defeat the Southwestern Front, commanded by General M. Kirpinose, take Kiev and go to Rostov, the gate to the Caucasian oil. And only then to deal with Moscow. The decision on the direction of further strikes was never taken. But the Nazi generals, who feared a protracted war and believed that a decisive victory would be achieved by capturing the capital, continued their feverish preparations for an attack on Moscow from the south, across the Bryansk front, in the hope, as Guderian wrote, that Hitler would eventually agree to this plan. Hitler made the final decision only on August 21, setting it out in an order to army groups. The OKH proposal to develop operations in the direction of Moscow does not correspond to my plans. The most important goal before the onset of winter is not to capture Moscow, but to capture the Crimea, the industrial and coal region of Donbass, and deprive the Russians of access to Caucasian oil. Army Group Center was ordered to turn the main forces to the south and, in cooperation with Group South, Field Marshal K. Rundstedt, encircle and destroy the troops of the Soviet Southwestern Front. The Soviet Supreme High Command, VGK, reasonably believed that the stabilization in the Moscow direction was temporary, and the enemy did not abandon the previous goal, capturing the capital, but would try to break through to the south, through Bryansk. German Command Tank KAPZ.BF.WG.3 KIB from the 11th Panzer Division. October 1941. On August 16, 1941, the Bryansk front was created to cover Moscow in this direction. But this assessment was correct until August 21, that is, until Hitler's decision to turn south. Soviet intelligence, unfortunately, was unable to timely reveal the new plans of the Germans. But the possibility of such a turn was foreseen by a member of the headquarters of the Supreme Command, General G.K. Zhukov. On August 19, 1941, 2 days before Hitler's order, he sent a telegram to I.V. Stalin, attack on Moscow, and, going over to active defense against the western and reserve fronts, he threw all his mobile and tank units against the central and southwestern fronts. Possible enemy plan, to defeat the central front and, having reached the Chernigov-Konotop-Preluki region, to defeat the armies of the southwestern front with a blow from the rear. After that, the main blow to Moscow, bypassing the Bryansk forests, and a blow to the Don base. Calculation of an anti-aircraft machine gun on the roof of the hotel, Moscow. October 1941. But even after Zhukov's warning, the headquarters of the Supreme High Command continued to see the main threat in a strike on Moscow. On August 24, during negotiations on Stalin's HF with the commander of the Bryansk front, Eremenko, a premature decision was made, as it turned out later, to disband the Central Front and transfer the 31st and 21st Armies to Bryansk. At the same time, Eremenko promised Stalin, of course, to defeat the scoundrel Guderian. It was too bold a promise, since the front did not have the strength to break. On the same day, August 24, 1941, Shaposhnikov warned by telephone that the strike should be expected tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Relying on the approval of the Stavka about the German strike on Moscow, Eremenko strengthened his right flank. But Guderian chose just the strip of the disbanded Central Front for a breakthrough and hit not on the right, Moscow, but on the left flank and, having tied it up with battles, rushed south with the main forces, towards the group of General Kleist. Eremenko's attempt to cling to Guderian's tail, to inflict defeat with their strikes, did not have significant success and did not stop the German columns. The German turn to the south gave Moscow one more month, September, to deploy its defenses. But we have to note with bitterness that Moscow's happiness turned into a tragedy for the southwestern front, which was surrounded and made its way to new lines from the ring with huge losses. Kiev, by order of the Stavka, was abandoned. Misses and miscalculations bets were expensive. The reserves intended for the defense of Moscow were spent on closing the gaps on the southern wing of the Soviet-German front. The strategic situation sharply became more complicated and worsened. The location of the shock groups of F. von Bock and the plan for the capture of Moscow in October-November 1941. The beginning of the battle. October onslaught of Typhoon. On September 6, 1941, Hitler signed Directive No. 35, codenamed Operation Typhoon. After 10 days, von Bock began to create shock groups. His plan was to break through the Soviet defenses with 3 powerful blows from the regions of Dukhovshchina, Roslavl and Shostka and encircle the troops of the Western, Reserve and Bryansk fronts in the region of Vyazma and Bryansk. After that, field armies deliver a frontal attack on Moscow, and cover it with tank and motorized pincers from the north and south, closing the second ring in the Noginsk region. With the technical and tactical superiority that the German troops then possessed, the plan looked flawless, and it seems all the more strange now that after 2 months it turned into such an unexpected embarrassment for the German strategists. German soldiers take a Soviet infantryman prisoner. Western Front, Vyazma region, October 1941. The Germans, using their favorite method of deep tank bypasses covers, for the first time closed the pincers near Minsk. For the second time they also broke through to Smolensk, and now for the third time with the same maneuver, widely spreading their mobile fists on a 600-kilometer front, they decided to arrange a huge cauldron around Moscow. On the night of October 2, 1941, the appeal of the Führer and the command of the Wehrmacht was read to the German soldiers of the Eastern Front. German soldiers. It said, in less than 3 months you have destroyed countless enemy divisions, captured an innumerable number of prisoners, occupied endless spaces. The upcoming offensive, perhaps for the first time, will be considered by all the nations of Europe as a common action to save the continent, the prerequisites for the last cruel mortal blow. On the distant approaches to Moscow, troops and equipment are moving to the front. On the road are ZIS-5 knotty-track tractors and ZIS-5 trucks with anti-tank hedgehogs. We must pay tribute to the Germans as an enemy, appreciate the German army, the strongest at that time, well-trained and armed, with experience in victorious wars, psychologically stable and convinced by the ideologists of National Socialism of the need to seize land in the East, for the good of the Reich, for the sake of destruction of Russian Bolshevism, in the name of the New Ordnung, the New World Order in Europe. It should also be recognized, as G.K. Zhukov noted, that the German General Staff and German staffs in general then worked better than our General Staff and our staffs in general. The German command at that time thought better and deeper than our commanders. We learned how to fight in the course of the war and learned and began to defeat the Germans, but it was a long process. And this process began with the fact that on the side of the Germans there was an advantage in all respects. In a maneuverable war of engines, operations are fleeting. The situation changes unexpectedly and abruptly, turning into a defeat for that military leader who does not have time to fend off blows with countermaneuvers. It was in this situation that the commands of our fronts found themselves at the beginning of the Moscow battle, which lasted 3 months and, according to the nature of the task solved by the Soviet troops, is divided into 2 periods: defensive, from September 30th to December 6, 1941, and offensive, from December 5, 1941 to January 8, 1942. German tank PZ, KPFW.3 from the 11th Panzer Division. Soviet-German front, September-October 1941. The Germans concentrated 3/4 of all their troops on the Eastern Front against Moscow. By October 1st, Army Group Center had 64 divisions, including 13 armored, 6 motorized, consisting of 3 field armies, 9th, 4th and 2nd, and 3, out of 4, tank groups, 3, th, 4th and 2nd. They were supported by the 2nd Air Fleet. A total of 1,800,000 people, 42%, 2,000 tanks, 75%, 14,000 guns and mortars, 34%, and 1,320 aircraft, 50%. The Germans had never before concentrated such forces as part of one group and in one direction. Our 3 fronts, Western, Reserve and Bryansk, were able to oppose the Germans with only 1,250,000 people, 7,600 guns and mortars, 900 tanks, 1,368 aircraft. Typhoon was supposed to sweep away everything in its path. The left flank grouping of the Germans, the 9th and 2nd Armies, the 3rd Tank Group of Goth, 23 divisions, including 3 tank and 2 motorized, from the Dukovshchina region aimed at the line Vyazma, Brezhev to cover Vyazma from north. The Central Group, the 4th Army and the 4th Panzer Group of Gopna, 22 divisions, including 5 tank and 1 motorized, advanced from Roslabel to Sparsk-Demensk with the task of capturing Vyazma from the south. Its flank was covered by the 2nd Army, 8 infantry divisions. Inspection of the captured German tank PZ, KPFW-2 from the 10th Panzer Division. Western Front, March 1942. Guderian's right flank grouping, 6 infantry, 5 tank, 3 motorized, dealt the main blow to Oral, Tula from Shostka. At the same time, offensives were resumed in the Leningrad, Tikhvin, and Rostov directions, as well as in the Crimea, in order to deprive the Russians of the opportunity to send reinforcements to Moscow. The density of battle formations of German strike groups reached 3 kilometers per division, which provided the Germans with multiple superiority in breakthrough zones. For example, the superiority of the enemy in the zone of the 24th and 43rd Armies of the Reserve Front was, in men, 3.2, in tanks, 8.5, in artillery, 7 times. In addition, the operational formation of the Soviet troops did not correspond to the impending threat. The Western Front, commanded by General I.S. Combe, was deployed in one echelon. The depth of its army defense was 15 to 20 kilometers, and the front, 35 to 40 kilometers. On the Reserve Front, out of 6 armies, 2, 24th and 43rd, were deployed between the Western and Bryansk, and 3 in the rear of the Western and 1, 33rd, was in reserve, Sparsk-Demensk region. Such a formation made it difficult to control the armies of the first echelon, which were separated from the main forces. The Stu G3 assault gun from the 226th Assault Gun Battalion is forcing a water barrier. Western Front, November 1941. The beginning of the battle for Moscow was complicated by the miscalculations of the headquarters and the front commands. By the 20th of September, the headquarters had established that the Germans were preparing a new major offensive and, given the unpreparedness of our troops for serious offensive operations, gave the order on the 27th, the Western and Bryansk fronts dig into the ground, and only if it is necessary to improve positions, undertake private operations. On September 29, Marshal B. Shaposhnikov confirmed with a directive the procedure for conducting them. But the order was clearly too late, and with a shortage of time, the conduct of any private operations diverted forces from strengthening the defense and led to unnecessary losses. The reserve front was not assigned the task of going over to the defensive at all. Repair of T-26 tanks at one of the factories in Moscow. December 1941. For the Soviet troops, the Battle of Moscow began in conditions of a large shortage of people and weapons. With a low density of troops, the defensive lines were built according to the focal principle and did not have sufficient depth. The entire system of fire damage was ineffective and, accordingly, the defense as a whole turned out to be vulnerable to attacks by German tanks, artillery and aircraft. And when on September 30 the Germans rushed to the offensive in the Oriel, and on October 2 in the Vyazma directions, they immediately broke through the defenses of the Soviet fronts. But the main reason for the defeat was that the headquarters and the command of the fronts failed to unravel the plan of the German strategists and the possible directions of massive attacks in a timely manner. And as a result, even those areas hastily prepared to repel the enemy were 100 to 110 kilometers away from the main attacks of the German troops. On the Western Front, they expected a joint strike by the 16th and 19th Armies along the Smolensk-Vyazma highway, moving the most equipped units there, and the Germans struck north and south of the highway. On the left wing of Bryansk, troops that were out of cover fell under the tank rampart, as they were preparing for a private operation. General L. M. Sandalov, then Chief of Staff of the front, later wrote, looking back, now considering the situation with open cards, you are perplexed. How could we not then guess the intentions of the enemy? The headquarters warned on September 27 about the preparation of the enemy for the offensive of the tank group on Moscow. There is no better area than the Glukov-Novorossiysk area. The path from there to Oral, Tula was the shortest. However, the command and headquarters of the front could not decipher this easy cipher. In the early hours and days of the Vyazemsko-Bryansk operation, the situation changed rapidly. Breakthroughs on the fronts by October 3 reached, on the western, 50 kilometers, on the reserve, 80 kilometers, on the Bryansk, up to 200 kilometers, Eagle was taken. On October 4 to 5, Sparsk-Demensk and Yuknov were taken in the reserve zone. And in the center of the western, breaking through at the junction of the 19th and 30th Armies, the tanks of Gopna and Goth by October 7 closed for Soviet armies in a ring at Vyazma, the 19th, 20th, 24th and 32nd. The German assault gun Stu G3 from the 177th Division got stuck in the mud. Western Front, November 1941. The Soviet General Staff did not even believe the first air reconnaissance reports about the movement of enemy columns towards Yuknov. And the Germans really were 200 kilometers from the capital, where, apart from construction battalions, there were no other troops. The 22nd, 29th, and 31st Armies, fiercely fighting back, retreated to the northeast to the Saltanovka-Sychevka line. The way to Moscow was open, and here it should be noted that in the Soviet Supreme High Command, certainly shocked by the unexpected turn of events, there was no panic or confusion. There was a certain nervousness, haste and inconsistency of decisions with the prevailing situation. But Stalin and Stavka methodically and stubbornly sought to turn the tide of events in favor of the Soviet troops. Soviet T-60 tanks from the 28th Tank Brigade are moving to the front line. Western Front, 16th Army, November 1941. German scouts from the 10th Panzer Division on NSU motorcycles. Soviet-German Front, November 1941. After unsuccessful counterattacks, on October 6, the headquarters ordered Kove to withdraw troops to the Rezhev-Vyazma line. But the ring at Vyazma had already closed, and the maneuver turned out to be associated with large casualties and loss of equipment. Their exact numbers have not yet been established. In German publications there are data, 1 million, including 688,000 prisoners, 6,000 guns, 830 tanks. But these are clearly some kind of combined or mythical figures of frontline reports, because there were simply no such quantities near Vyazma. The Soviet leadership took immediate and decisive action to restore the defenses and combat readiness of the fronts, trying in those conditions to win the main thing, time to create reserves and retaliate. Stalin recalled from Leningrad G.K. Zhukov, a commander capable of accurately and truthfully assessing the situation, foreseeing and controlling the course of events, without stopping at tough, if the situation so required, measures. On the night of October 7, Stalin, ill with the flu, sharply assessing the actions of the commanders, pointed to the map to Zhukov and said, "Look. There is a very difficult situation here. I cannot get an exhaustive report from the Western Front on the true state of affairs. We cannot make a decision without knowing where and in what grouping the enemy is advancing, and what condition our troops are in. Go at once to the headquarters of the Western Front, carefully examine the state of affairs and call me from there at any time. I'll be waiting." Immediately he wrote a note, later issued as the order of the headquarters number 002684 dated October 6, 1941, at 19:30, suggesting that the fronts familiarize the representative of the headquarters, Comrade Zhukov, with the situation, and in the future, all his decisions on the use of troops of the fronts and their control should be considered mandatory. Heavy armored car SD KFZ 263 from Guderian 2nd Panzer Army near Tula. November 1941. The tragedy of what happened in those days was manifested in everything, in the haste and inconsistency of actions, in the disorganization, ignorance and confusion of the front commands. At the headquarters of Kov, where Zhukov arrived at night, they could not intelligibly report to him what was happening with the troops surrounded to the west and northwest of Vyazma. There was no connection. The commander of the reserve front, S.M. Budyonny, Zhukov found only on October 9 in Maloyaroslavets without communication with the armies and his headquarters. On the way to Kaluga, Zhukov was caught up by a communications officer with two decisions on the appointment at once, in Stalin's telegram, the commander of the reserve, and in the decision of the GKO Commission, the Western Front. What order to follow? Shaposhnikov clarified over the phone, a united front was being created with the task of preventing the Germans from breaking through Mozhaisk and Sepukov. The following episode is no less characteristic. On October 5, the commander of the 16th Army, K. Rokossovsky, received an order from Kov and Bylinin to surrender troops to General Urshakov, to arrive in Vyazma with headquarters, receive 5 divisions and strike at Yuknov. Rokossovsky, having already broken through the orders of the Germans and subjugating the units and formations of the encirclement, went to Vyazma. Not finding troops there, he made his way to his own, to Gajatsk, and, arriving at the headquarters of the front, was met by Voroshilov's formidable question: "How did you end up in Vyazma with the headquarters, but without the troops of the 16th Army?" Rokossovsky replied that Kov ordered to receive new divisions near Vyazma and showed the ill-fated order. There was a stormy conversation between Voroshilov and Kov and Bylinin, but the same episode appears in a different light. According to Kov's oral report to Zhukov on October 7, "I ordered Rokossovsky to withdraw the 16th through Vyazma, concentrate in the forests east of the city, but parts of the army were already cut off and remained surrounded." Rokossovsky himself with his headquarters managed to slip into Vyazma and is now in the forest east of the city. German troops are advancing towards Moscow. In the foreground is the PZ, KPFW.4 Ausf. F1. Western Front, November 1941. Where is the truth, in the order or in the report? And further, according to the situation at the front, Kov reported, "I have no connection with the commanders of the 19th Lukin and the 20th Urshakov. I don't know what position they are in. There is no communication with neighboring fronts either." In the army of the right wing, the 22nd, 29th, 31st, which suffered less, sent an order to withdraw to the Volga line, Rezhev, Sychevka. The front does not have the strength to close the central direction to Moscow. The price of the mistakes of military leaders is the blood, death and captivity of our soldiers. But those of them who still held weapons in their hands amazed the Germans with the fury of counterattacks, perseverance and steadfastness in seemingly hopeless situations. The Germans failed the main thing, to break the will of the defenders of Moscow to resist. Already on October 8 at 2:30, Zhukov reported to Stalin the situation and his decision. The main danger now lies in the weak cover on the Mozhaisk line. The armored forces of the enemy may therefore appear near Moscow. It is necessary to quickly pull troops from wherever possible to the Mozhaisk line of defense. Directive of the headquarters of the Supreme High Command number 002844 on October 10, 1941, at 17 o'clock. 0 minutes. Zhukov was appointed commander of the United Western Front, Deputy I. Kov, Chief of Staff General V. Sokolovsky, member of the Military Council M. Bylinin, and, with his characteristic energy, set about restoring the front at the line Kalinin, Volokholamsk, Mozhaisk, Maloroslavets Kaluga. But what did he get after the disaster? The main thing is, he wrote to Stanov on October 2, 1941, that Kov and Budyonny overslept all their armed forces, took one memory from them. From Budyonny, headquarters and 30 people, from Kov, headquarters and 2 spare regiments. The front is full of gaps and gaps, through which von Bock's tank columns aimed at Moscow. The command of the Western Front was intensely looking for ways of fighting that would ensure success. Here are some decisions from directives and orders of the front. The Germans are rushing along the roads, close them, let them climb into the forests and swamps. Since there are no forces for continuous defense, to saddle all the main directions with armies, on Volokholamsk, 16th K. Rokossovsky, on Mozhaisk, 50, Lilyashenko, after being wounded, L. Govorov, on Nerofominsk, 33rd M. Efremov, on Maloroslavetsky, 43rd K. Golyub, near Kaluga, 45th K. Zakharkin. Here, too, most of the artillery and anti-tank weapons. To knock out tanks first of all, the main striking force of the Germans. Bury in the ground, in trenches, cracks, bunkers. Gird yourself with thorns, minefields, all possible obstacles. Defense is only active for an attack, a counterattack, for a blow, a counterattack, to force von Bock to spray groupings to repel continuous counterattacks. Our armies occupy wide strips along the front, 100 kilometers or more. The strings of their divisions are thin, there are few reserves in the rear. This means that it is necessary to concentrate all types of artillery, up to anti-aircraft, 37 mm, and Katyushas, into single groups. German 150 mm self-propelled howitzer SIG-33, SF, from the 5th Panzer Division. Western Front, December 1941. Plan a quick transfer of artillery groups to threatened areas, cover artillery with infantry units from attacks by German machine gunners, subordinating them to battery commanders. To repel tank breakthroughs, create mobile detachments of sappers in cars and carts with mines and explosive charges, to mine ditches and passing sections. Since the density of troops is low, possible breakthroughs must be eliminated by quick maneuvers of the reserves. During the fighting, our commanders found many operational and tactical solutions and methods that were unexpected for the German troops. The headquarters took urgent measures to protect the capital. On the night of October 5, the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks and the State Defense Committee determined the Mozhaisk line as the main line of defense, where 14 rifle divisions, 16 tank brigades and more than 40 artillery regiments were hastily transferred from other fronts, as well as from Siberia and Kazakhstan. The 16th, 5th, 43rd and 45th armies were reformed. But the formations were not fully staffed, their total number did not exceed 90,000 people. Another 5 divisions were formed from the encirclement by A. Vasilevsky with a group of commanders. From the far east, several rifle and tank divisions rushed towards Moscow non-stop. It was decided to form reserve armies. On October 12, a resolution was adopted on the creation of the Moscow Defense Zone, responsible, the commander of the Moscow Military District, General Artemiev. Militia divisions were formed, about 50,000 people were sent to the battle zone. Fighters and commanders. In a matter of days, 600,000 residents of Moscow and the region, 3/4 of them women, built hundreds of kilometers of anti-tank ditches, 3,800 pillboxes and bunkers. On the difficult issue of providing the troops with guns, equipment, and ammunition, a harsh decision had to be made to speed up the entry of factories evacuated to the east. At the same time, events unfolded dramatically in the encircled armies near Vyazma. By order of the headquarters, they were brought under the unified command of the Commander, 19, General K.F. Lukin, and made a desperate attempt to break out of the encirclement. Thus, the encirclement did not allow the Germans to develop a further offensive. This is evidenced by a radiogram from the commander of the 7th Panzer Division, General Fuchs, who, when asked why his division was not going to Moscow, angrily replied to his superiors that the commander of the Russian 19th was also rushing towards Moscow, and that the German division was barely holding a breakthrough. Lukin's united group made several attempts to break through, however, dispersed over a large area, it was difficult to manage, sometimes acted without communication and interaction between individual parts, experiencing an extreme lack of ammunition, fuel and food. The first attempt to break through ended in failure. The armies came under heavy bombardment by enemy aircraft. The help of the headquarters and the front with raids by our aviation on German orders and the delivery of ammunition to the surrounded by air due to lack of funds and forces was too limited. Twice, on October the 10th and 12th, Lukin could not answer Zhukov's radiogram indicating the area of the breakthrough and the oncoming strike. The connection was interrupted. Subsequent attempts were carried out in compact parallel columns and ended with breakthroughs of individual formations, units and groups. Commander M.F. Lukin, wounded 4 times, was captured in an unconscious state. The total number of troops that broke through from the encirclement is still unknown. The figures found in the literature are very approximate: 85,000 broke through in an organized manner and 65,000 in small groups and alone. But circumstantial evidence gives reason to talk about large numbers. The main reasons for the failure are obvious: insufficient assistance from the headquarters and the front command, which did not have sufficient funds in a desperate situation, and the delay in organizing the breakthrough of the encirclement themselves, as a result of which the Germans managed to strengthen the positions of the ring. Even the first attempt to break through was subjected to the strongest bombardment by German aircraft, resulted in scattered attacks by the armies and ran into a solid tank barrier of 6 tank divisions with infantry units attached to them. But the death of the encircled units, their blood and sacrifices, as noted by Zhukov and other participants in those tragic events, were not in vain. The German command was forced to fight on a front with a depth of 100 to 150 kilometers from west to east, losing thousands of soldiers and a considerable amount of equipment in battle. This reduced the strike force of the German formations intended to capture Moscow. Only in mid-October, von Bock, finally freeing himself from the cauldron, was able to pull up the divisions to the front line and rush to Moscow with renewed vigor. Fierce fighting unfolded in all directions, and these were the hardest days for our troops. There was no solid front yet, and well-trained and equipped German troops, bypassing the centers of defense, attacking from the flanks or from the rear, energetically moved forward, tearing one or the other section of the front with armored wedges. A few, hastily formed and still insufficiently organized formations fought heroically against them. In a situation that changed daily, even hourly, the outcome of the battle, the operation, and ultimately the fate of Moscow, depended on the strength and stubbornness of each regiment, each battalion, and sometimes even a company or platoon. Armored Car SD KFZ.221. The German climbed on it for a better view. Western Front, December 1941. But we must admit that not everyone fought courageously. In some formations, reformed after the disaster, tank fear and aircraft fear were common. They were in a state of psychological breakdown and did not possess stable morale and combat qualities. At the very first attacks of German tanks and aircraft, they could leave their positions without an order, simply run. So, without a fight, due to the weakness of the commanders, Tarantino, Ruza and other points were surrendered. In those desperate days, in a critical situation, cowardice and panic, especially on the part of the commanders, posed a particular danger and, as determined in the orders, was tantamount to betrayal. Therefore, the front command had to resort to extreme measures, not just tough, but cruel. A whole group of commanders and political workers was put on trial. Along with emergency measures, the command persistently taught the troops to retreat in an organized manner, bearing in mind that retreat is the most difficult type of combat operations, requiring good training of the troops and firm command and control. The Soviet front, stretched out in a thin line, with difficulty held the pressure of the enemy. On October 14, the Germans broke into Kalinin, Tver. It was also not possible to stabilize the defense at the Moshaist line. In order to prevent the enemy from breaking through to Moscow, the military council made a difficult decision, to withdraw the front in an organized manner to a new line, closer to the capital. Before a difficult meeting of the military council, Bylinin, turning to Zhukov, exhaled with alarm. "Don't cut off our heads, Georgy Konstantinovich." In response, Zhukov cut off briefly. "We can't take our heads off when the Germans break through to Moscow. Our troops are fighting with extraordinary tenacity, but the situation is critical. At the turn of Volokholamsk, Moshaist, Maloyaroslavets, we can no longer hold out. The headquarters and the general staff must be convinced of this, and convinced. The front was withdrawn to the Klinistrasapukov-Alexin line. At the same time, at the request of the military council, the headquarters formed the Kalinin Front, Commander I. Komv, transferring to it 3 Western armies. Management directly in the Moscow direction was facilitated. The tension in the general situation did not abate in October. On October 16, the State Defense Committee makes a decision to evacuate state institutions and the government from Moscow to Kuybyshev, Samara. The evacuation of industrial enterprises also continued. The panic that broke out in Moscow, looting and riots, traffic jams, which made it difficult to supply the front, were decisively suppressed within a few hours. On October 20, 1941, a state of siege was introduced in Moscow by a decree of the State Defense Committee. Its defense 100 to 200 kilometers to the west was assigned to Zhukov, and on the near approaches to the head of the garrison, General Artemiev, T-40 light tanks abandoned by the Soviet troops. 121st Tank Brigade, Task Force of General Ermakov. Bryansk Front, October 1941. The German High Command considered that the Russians had already been defeated and that they had no reserves, so they ordered the Center Group to continue their offensive against Moscow and surround it without any pause. Von Bock in mid-October, making sure that through the active defense of the Russians with their continuous counterattacks, it was impossible to break through in the center, he concentrated his efforts on the flanks. Deployed the 3rd Panzer Group and the 9th Field Army to the north and northeast to attack Kalinin, Torshok, Vyshny Volochysk. He sent the 2nd Panzer Group and the 2nd Field Army to Tula to bypass Moscow. In the Moscow direction, the onslaught of the 2-4s, 4th Tank Group and 4th Field Army, decreased. Von Bock spread his flanking fists wide apart, but reduced his superiority along the front in the center. Zhukov instantly grasped the benefit of these changes for defense. Throughout October, German troops stubbornly advanced towards Moscow. On October 15, they managed to capture Borovsk, on the 18th Maloyaroslavets and Mozhaisk, on the 22nd Nerofominsk, on the 27th Volokholamsk. But Zhukov and his army commanders immediately organized strong counterattacks in these areas, as well as near Skermanovo and Dorohovo. This forced von Bock to feverishly transfer 2 to 3 divisions from the flank groups to repel them. The Germans have paid an excessive price for success, said a report from one German corps commander to the headquarters of the Center Group. Von Bock failed to create either deep operational breakthroughs or cauldrons. For this he simply did not have enough strength at the decisive moment. By the end of October, the outcome of the battles was unexpected for the Nazi leadership. 2-4s in the center and both bypass groups were exhausted and stopped. The Typhoon sank. Von Bock was forced to give a break to the troops in order to make up for losses and regroup. There was a lull on the battle line, and a deadline for the high commands of both sides to make new decisions. Map of the breakthrough of the Bryansk front from the encirclement. October 1941. The results of the reflection of the October pressure of the Typhoon, impressive. The German commanders, with a significant superiority of their troops in the Moscow direction, failed to achieve their main goals. Moscow was not surrounded and taken neither by October 15 nor by October 30. The Soviet commanders with small forces managed to exhaust and stop the shock groups and, most importantly, gain time, the factor of which was becoming more and more decisive. Winter was coming, the Germans were not prepared for it, and the Russians were successfully preparing and bringing in new reserves. Meanwhile, on the left wing of the Bryansk fighting unfolded no less dramatic. Guderian's bypass grouping, having launched an offensive on September 30, broke through the defenses of the 13th Army, entering the rear of the front from the south, and at the same time the 2nd German Army, through a gap in the 43rd Army of the Reserve Front, rushed towards it from the north, intercepting the Moscow Railway, Bryansk. Seeing the brewing boiler, the commander of the Bryansk Front A, Eremenko, late in the evening of October 5 reported the situation to the General Staff B. Shaposhnikov. Considering that the troops of the front were still combat-ready, Eremenko proposed an unusual and bold maneuver. Set up barriers on the western, frontal, line, and turn the main forces of the Bryansk front 180 degrees, strike at the still weak chain of encirclement and reach new defensive lines. But the headquarters hesitated, hoping to hold the main positions, and gave permission only on the morning of October 7. By this time the situation had become more complicated. The enemy, who broke into Oral on October 3, had already captured Bryansk and Karachev by October 6 and captured the entire Bryansk-Oryol region, which the German command defined as a springboard for bypassing Moscow from the south. It should be noted that the rapid capture of Oryol was due to the disorganization and carelessness of the local leadership. The defense of the city, located 200 kilometers from the front line, was assigned by the Stavka to the military council of the district, Commander General Tyrin A. On September 30, Yeremenko, immediately after the breakthrough of the front, warned the district about the threat and received assurances in the preparation of defense. But on October 3, the city was immediately taken. And this despite the fact that in the city and the district there were 4 anti-tank regiments, a howitzer regiment, several infantry units and 10,000 bottles of KS. With such forces, and even having mobilized the population, it was possible to repel a massive attack of tanks. Like German tank PZ KPFW.I stuck in the mud. Soviet-German front, November 1941. The situation near Tula, for example, was completely different, where Guderian went out on October 30, but could not break into the city. He was stopped by the 50th Army and a rebuff organized by the leadership of Tula and the region, headed by the secretary of the regional committee V.G. Zavoronkov, who raised the communists, Komsomol members and everyone capable of bearing arms to the defense. Thousands of Tula people were already digging trenches and ditches under fire, building bunkers and barricades. The first blow was repelled by a working regiment, Captain A. Gorshkov, Military Commissar Ajeev, an NKVD regiment, Major S. Zubkov, and the 739th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel M. Bondarenko. It was near Tula and in the battles near Msensk and Kashira that the spurt of the southern bypass grouping of the Germans got stuck and died out. On October 7, Eremenko began a 180 degrees turn on the entire front. But the maneuver began already in the environment and the enemy managed to intercept all the main communications. The armies were given 5 lines, the timing of the exit and the direction of strikes, the 50th, to Bezhitsa, Karachev, Zmivka, 3rd to Trubchevsk, St. Ponyry, 13th to Poga, Fatesh. Groups of Generals Ermakov and Reiter, to cover the flank of the front. Neither Guderian nor the German High Command, inspired by new breakthroughs and successes, did not expect that the encircled front would suddenly all at once strike to the east. And when the 13th, with a blow from 2 divisions and a tank brigade, broke through the chain of encirclement, Guderian had to close this hole with an entire tank corps, 47th, and other units. His statement that only the headquarters and small groups of Russians slipped along the road to Sevsk is not true. In fact, the entire 13th Army came out. And by October 22, with the continuous support of frontline aviation, she reached the planned Fatesh-Makarov line as part of 7 divisions and a tank brigade, retaining a full-time organization. However, the number of divisions after losses was 1,000 to 2,000 bayonets each. At the same time, the damage of the Germans amounted to 3,000 soldiers and officers, 100 guns and mortars, 30 tanks, 15 aircraft. Tank column PZ, KPFW.4 Ausf.E. Soviet-German Front, Army Group Center, November 1941. German tank PZ, KPFW.3 Ausf.J from the 2nd Panzer Division. Army Group Center, November 1941. The 3rd Army, Commander Y.A. Kreiser, broke through solid swamps in the Desna-Trubchevska, Swappa. On the night of October 8, having made a march of 60 kilometers, an exceptional case for the infantry, the army met the positions prepared by the Germans and, after 2 unsuccessful attempts, broke out of the encirclement at dawn on October 22. Guderian writes in his memoirs that in order to strengthen the encirclement he had to send a tank and motorized division, but, despite the help, a group of Russians managed to break through and reach Dmitrovsk, Orlovsky. The 3rd Army reached the line of Art. Ponyry in 6 divisions that suffered losses, but still numbered more than 2,000 bayonets in each. The 50th Army began a turn on the night of October 8 and left in the best possible condition, inflicting the greatest damage to the enemy. But in this operation, Commander M. Petrov and a member of the military council N. Shlyapin died. The army, having come across a strong tank and artillery barrier in the southeast, crushed the enemy with a blow to the northeast and on October 23 came north of the indicated line to the line of the river Oka in the Belev area, consisting of 7 divisions, a tank brigade, several separate rifle and artillery regiments. The divisions numbered 3,000 people each, retained artillery batteries, some even artillery regiments, communications battalions and other units. And already on November 7, the 50th launched a counterattack near Tula, then near Bylinin, in cooperation with the Third Army. While the German generals believed that both of these armies were destroyed by them, the front was finishing the maneuver already without its commander. On October 13, when the troops of the front broke through the last barrier line, Eremenko was seriously wounded in the shoulder and leg and severely shell-shocked by an air bomb explosion. But the maneuver with a 180-degree turn and a strike by the entire front to the east in that critical situation yielded significant results. Here, on the southern wing, in the October battles, the swing of the armored fist towards Moscow was intercepted and slowed down. The southern group of Germans captured the springboard, Bryansk, Oral, but could not achieve the main goal, a breakthrough to Moscow. Bound by battles, she suffered irreparable losses and soon got stuck near Tula. Stalin gave a high assessment to the actions of the Bryansk front, who called the commander, who was recovering in the Kremlin hospital on the night of October 26 to 27. He said, "I congratulate you, Comrade Eremenko, on your great success. The troops of your front, being surrounded, showed high organization, valor and courage, and it is especially commendable that, despite the absolute superiority of the enemy, in the most difficult conditions, they showed initiative and fought with unprecedented stamina. The armies not only advanced in an organized manner to new frontiers, but inflicted significant damage on the enemy. I congratulate you on this success." He repeated again, "I trouble you at this hour, knowing that you are waiting for news of your soldiers." The offensive of the German troops on the right wing of the Western Front in November 1941. November assault. Typhoon is running out of steam. The German Supreme High Command, after the October onslaught did not achieve its main goals, was in a hurry to prepare troops for a new assault on the capital, sought to preempt the Russians in securing defenses on the approaches and in transferring reserves from the inner districts. Hitler hurried his generals, categorically demanded from them, in the near future, at any cost, to put an end to Moscow. On November 13, 1941, in the city of Orsha, Chief of the General Staff F. Halder held a meeting of the Chiefs of Staff of the Eastern Front formations. This meeting was, according to Hitler, to push the generals to the fastest implementation of the Barbarossa Plan. But, unlike the meeting on August 4 in Borisov, the offensive fervor of the generals faded and wilted. Many of them expressed serious concerns about what was happening at the front, meaning, first of all, October battles near Moscow. Halder, more than anyone else aware of the losses, condition, and combat effectiveness of the Wehrmacht, could not help but understand that a new assault could end in another failure. But Hitler's directive put pressure on him, before the onset of winter, by all means, deal with the USSR. Therefore, as an executive military commander, he confirmed the well-known goals of the Führer and dictated to the generals the maximum and minimum line of advance in 1941. The first, up to Maykop, Stalingrad, Gorky, Vologda; the second, to the mouth of the Don, Tambov, Rybinsk. In any case, Moscow was to be stormed. The idea of blitzkrieg continued to dominate. Before the onset of winter, by all means deal with the USSR. Therefore, as an executive military commander, he confirmed the well-known goals of the Führer and dictated to the generals the maximum and minimum line of advance in 1941. The first, up to Maykop, Stalingrad, Gorky, Vologda; the second, to the mouth of the Don, Tambov, Rybinsk. In any case, Moscow was to be stormed. The idea of blitzkrieg continued to dominate. Before the onset of winter, by all means deal with the USSR. Therefore, as an executive military commander, he confirmed the well-known goals of the Führer and dictated to the generals the maximum and minimum line of advance in 1941. The first, up to Maykop, Stalingrad, Gorky, Vologda; the second, to the mouth of the Don, Tambov, Rybinsk. In any case, Moscow was to be stormed. The idea of blitzkrieg continued to dominate. Commander of the 1st Guards Tank Brigade M.E. Kartukov at the BA-10 Armored Car. Western Front, December 1941. By November 15, von Bock concentrated 51 divisions in the center group, including 31 infantry, 13 tank and 7 motorized divisions, staffed with personnel, tanks, artillery and military equipment. Archive of the USSR Ministry of Defense F. 208, Op 2511, L. 1022, L. 332. Von Bock's idea remained the same in its essence, to to surround Moscow with strikes from two powerful tank groups, and then strike with a grouping from the center and break into it. Groupings struck from the north and from the south. In the northern grouping in the Volokholamsk-Klinsk and Istra directions, von Bock concentrated the 3rd and 4th tank groups, consisting of 7 tank, 3 mechanized and 3 infantry divisions, supported by 2,000 guns and aviation. In the southern grouping in the Tula-Kashersky direction, he included 2 mechanized, 2 Army Corps, a total of 9 divisions, including 4 tank divisions, and a mechanized SS regiment Grossdeutschland. She was supported by a powerful air group. In the center, on the Svenigorod, Kuban, Nerofominsk, Podolsk and Sepukov directions, von Bock deployed the 4th Army, consisting of 6 Army Corps. It was this army that was ordered to pin down the Russian divisions with frontal attacks, overturn them and break into Moscow. Barrage balloon in the sky of Moscow. The outer flanks of the shock groups were covered, from the north and northwest, by the 9th Army, 15 infantry divisions, from the south, by the 2nd Army, 6 infantry, tank and motorized divisions. The plan of the German High Command seems flawless this time too. After all, the Russian armies are drained of blood, demoralized, poorly armed. They will not be able to stop an armored ram of such strength. But on the other side, things looked different. The Soviet High Command had a very clear idea of the intentions of the enemy and of the possibilities that he had. The headquarters of the Supreme High Command, correctly assessing the situation, urgently strengthened the Western Front. From November 1 to November 15, the headquarters handed over to the front several fresh rifle, cavalry and tank divisions and brigades, reinforced more than half of the armies with anti-tank artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers. In total, in the first half of November, the front received 100,000 men, 300 tanks, and 2,000 guns. And on November 10, he was transferred to the 50th Army of the Bryansk. November 11, 1941. The front was disbanded, his armies were transferred to the southwestern, and the 30th Kalinin Front. The tanks of the combined regiment of the Military Academy of Motorization and Mechanization of the Red Army go to the front. In the foreground is the T-35. Moscow, Lefortovo District, December 1941. The defense of Tula was now assigned to the Western Front. The headquarters and command of the fronts, using the lull, actively strengthened the defensive lines, replenished the troops with people and military equipment. Knowing the German plans to enter the Volga, the Stavka, on the instructions of the State Defense Committee, adopted on October 5, was completing the formation of the strategic echelon of the Red Army at the turn of Vitebsk, Rybinsk, Gorky, Saratov, Stalingrad, Astrakhan. 10 reserve armies were deployed there, some of them were moved to Moscow in anticipation of a new German assault and counter-offensive. At the same time, the commands of the southern and Leningrad fronts were ordered to prepare offensive operations in the areas of Rostov and Tikhvin, to defeat the Rostov and Tikhvin groupings of the enemy and divert his reserves from the Moscow direction. The plan and battle order of the German shock groupings had by that time been revealed by our intelligence and were well known to Zhukov and the army commanders. But by the beginning of the assault on November 15 to 16, the troops that Zhukov could oppose von Bock were inferior to the Germans not only numerically, but also in terms of the quality of weapons and equipment of military equipment. Although the Western Front by this time had more divisions than the enemy, they were significantly inferior to the German ones in terms of the number of firepower and personnel. Superiority as a whole was on the side of the Germans, in people, 2 times, in tanks, 1.5 times, in guns and mortars, 2.5 times. And in the main directions, the Germans generally had an overwhelming superiority. Air defense sound detectors were intended for the early detection of enemy aircraft by the sound of engines. So, in the Klin direction against 56 tanks and 210 guns and mortars of the 30th Army, they put forward 300 tanks and 910 guns and mortars. On the Istra against 150 tanks and 767 guns and mortars of the 16th Army, 400 tanks and 1030 guns and mortars were concentrated. In the Kashira direction, the enemy concentrated 400 tanks and 810 guns and mortars against 45 tanks and 315 guns and mortars of the 50th Army. The advantage of the defenders of the capital was only in aviation, with a clear superiority in the main areas of breakthroughs. The general battle, as the German generals themselves defined the November assault, was doomed to success. With such a balance of forces, the Soviet generals had to wrest victory from the hands of the enemy, relying only on the courage, stamina, initiative of the Russian soldier and the skill of his commanders. It is impossible not to mention the remarkable event of those days, now legendary, the parade of Soviet troops on Red Square in besieged Moscow and the speech of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief I.V. Stalin. The Red Army cavalry and motorcyclists on the M-72 are moving through the capital. Moscow, November 1941. On November 1st, Zhukov arrived at Stalin's call. Entering his office and saying hello, he stopped waiting at the table with cards. Stalin leisurely walked around the office, lit his pipe and asked in an even voice. "We plan to hold in Moscow, in addition to the solemn meeting on the occasion of the anniversary of October, and a parade of troops. Do you think the situation at the front will allow us to hold these celebrations?" Zhukov, in the first second somewhat surprised by the strangeness of the idea. What a parade! The enemy is 80 kilometers from Moscow. In the next moment he was able to fully appreciate the enormous significance of what was planned. And in a military way, briefly and firmly answered. In the coming days, the enemy will not launch a major offensive. He suffered heavy losses in previous battles and is forced to replenish and regroup his troops. Against aviation, which will certainly act, it is necessary to strengthen air defense and bring fighter aircraft to Moscow from neighboring fronts. We will do just that, Stalin said with satisfaction. So the decision to parade was made. The morning of November 7th was frosty and windy, with snow falling the day before. Without the usual decorations of that day, Red Square looked deserted and majestic. With stern faces, with military weapons in their hands, the fighters and commanders of the Red Army froze in strict columns. Addressing the soldiers from the tribune of the mausoleum, who were leaving the parade to fight, Stalin told them, "The whole world is looking at you as a force capable of destroying the predatory hordes of German invaders. The enslaved peoples of Europe look at you as their liberators." He spoke about the greatness of the history of the motherland, about its great heroes. He named the names of Alexander Nevsky and Dmitry Donskoy, Dmitry Pozharsky and Kuzma Minin, Alexander Suvorov and Mikhail Kutuzov, inspiring in this terrible hour for Russia. And he ended his speech with an appeal, "Let the victorious banner of the great Lenin overshadow you." This non-holiday parade had a huge moral and political impact on the Soviet people. He returned faith to the doubters and raised the spirit of resistance at the front and in the rear. The parade was also of great international importance. He clearly refuted pessimistic forecasts about the imminent fall of Moscow, demonstrating to the whole world the strength and resilience of the Soviet people and their unbending will to defeat the enemy. Disguise of a KV tank from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade of the Red Army. Western Front, Defense Area of the 16th Army, December 1941. In November, the headquarters, in accordance with the strategic plan, concentrated 6 armies in the Moscow-Zagorskaya and Ryazksk region, 1st Shock, 20th, 24th and 60th, behind the junction of the Western and Southwestern fronts. The Western could receive up to 450,000 fresh troops. But for the deployment of armies in mid-November, it took 15 to 20 days, so the fronts were given the task of stubborn and active defense to prevent the enemy from breaking through to Moscow, Western, to keep the enemy at the turn of the river. Lama, Dubosekovo, Skermanovo, Noro, Oka, Tula, Bogoroditsk, and counterattacks on the Volokholamsk and Sapukov directions to disrupt his regroupings. Kalininsky, to hold their positions and counterattacks to prevent the transfer of enemy troops against the west. Southwest, to cover the Efremov and Yelets directions. And at Zhukov in the first half of November, all the days and hours were filled with the preparation of the front, especially on the flanks, for defense and, above all, anti-tank. Its organization became much more complicated, because General Frost came to the aid of the Germans, the same one who is still sometimes presented as the main culprit in the defeat of the Germans near Moscow. On the contrary, the Germans were hindered by the autumn thaw, and the fields and roads of the Moscow region hardened from the first frosts became passable for all types of heavy German equipment, tanks, assault guns, tractors, etc. A German artillery spotter hid behind a wrecked BT tank. Army Group Center, December 1941. The Soviet command strengthened the defensive lines. Frozen fields were covered with mines, KS bottles, obstacles of all kinds. Highways were destroyed to a depth of 100 kilometers in order to deprive German tanks of maneuver. Strongholds and 5 to 9 strong anti-tank areas were created in the army zones, using all types of artillery, with dense saturation with fighter units with rifles and anti-tank grenades. Reserves were created up to the regiment inclusive. Interaction with aviation, tanks, artillery was provided by representatives of these troops at the command post of each unit. Von Bock attacked, as expected, on the flanks. November 15, on the Volokholamsk-Klinsky direction, and 2 days later, on the Kashersky direction. The repulse of the first attacks was unexpectedly difficult for Zhukov by the sudden decision of the headquarters, which decided to forestall events. Fire support tank PZ, KPFW, 4 Ausf.F1 on the outskirts of Moscow. Western Front, December 1941. The day before, Stalin called and said, "Shaposhnikov and I believe that it is necessary to thwart the enemy's impending strikes with preemptive counterattacks. One counterattack must be delivered from the Volokholamsk region, the other from the Sepukov region to the flank of the Fourth Army." Zhukov, a stern realist who always acted aggressively, but by no means recklessly, categorically objected. "This cannot be done now. We cannot throw the last reserves of the front into counterattacks, the success of which is doubtful. We will have nothing to reinforce the defense when the enemy goes on the offensive with his strike groups." But then, the scythe found a stone. Stalin did not want to listen to objections and hung up BA-20M from the reconnaissance unit of the 112th Tank Division of the Red Army. Western Front, December 1941. Destroyed Soviet tank T-34-76 in winter camouflage. Western Front, December 1941. Premature counterattacks, mainly by the cavalry corps of Belov and Doveta, of course, were unsuccessful and only led to unnecessary deaths of people and the waste of hard-earned reserves. Von Bock brought down on the right flank of the front, on the 30th Army of D. Lilyashenko and the 16th K. Rokossovsky, a blow of enormous force. The 30th, under pressure from 300 German tanks, withdrew with heavy fighting south of the Volga Reservoir, and the 16th, yielding to the onslaught of 400 tanks, but continuously counterattacking, slowly retreated to the rear positions. It was in the zone of the 16th Army that the Battle of the Panfilovites took place. He was observed by Rokossovsky from the NP of the 316th Division of General Panfilov. The Germans eventually crawled to Kryakov and Krasnaya Polyana, coming closest to Moscow here. In the days of the main onslaught of the German groups, the consequences of the erroneous decision of the headquarters affected. Zhukov, having limited reserves, could not effectively fend off attacks. There were not enough troops. A gap formed between the 30th and 16th armies. The 16th Army left Klin on November 23 to avoid encirclement. To close the gap, Zhukov created a task force of F. Zakharov with the task of preventing the enemy from reaching Dmitrov and Yakroma. K. Rokossovsky vividly wrote about the extreme fierceness of the fighting in November, the heroism of the fighters and commanders. Remembering those days, in my thoughts I imagine the image of our 16th Army. Exhausted and bleeding from many wounds, she clung to every inch of her native land, giving the enemy a fierce rebuff. Taking a step back, she was again ready to strike back, and she did it. Both warring parties were in the highest tension. The commander of the Western Front did everything possible to reinforce the weakened troops at least a little, but at the same time not to be drawn into battle in parts incoming strategic reserves. By the decision of the headquarters, they were pulled up to Moscow, to the areas of greatest danger. They had to be saved until the decisive moment. This required strict calculation and great endurance. Fighting near Tula in November 1941. Destroyed German tank PZ, KPFW.3 with the badge of Guderian 2nd Panzer Group. The commander in a critical situation needs to find the solution that will lead the enemy to inevitable defeat. To do this, it is very important not to falter, not to rush about, not to lose self-control and the ability to soberly assess the situation. Deciding to repel the enemy's blows only with the available forces of the front and, thereby, to preserve reserves for the counter-offensive, Zhukov, the generals and officers of his headquarters showed themselves from the best side. It was a bold and risky decision. But it justified itself. What did Zhukov count on? First of all, the steadfastness of the troops, inspired by the holy idea of defending the motherland. What Rokossovsky said about the 16th Army is fully applicable to many formations that fought near Moscow. Such divisions as, for example, the 316th I. Panfilov or the 78th A. Beloborodov, fought heroically with a superior enemy. Getting into the bags, they stubbornly continued to fight, and, breaking out of the encirclement, again held the defense. In those days, for many fighters and commanders, the call, "fight to the death," was not just a slogan metaphor. They died under fire, rushed with grenades under the tracks of tanks, but kept on the lines. Anti-aircraft gunners on the outskirts of Tula are preparing to repel the attack of German tanks. Another reason for the decision was based on a careful analysis of the actions of the enemy. German generals, as if fascinated by the idea of encircling Moscow, by breakthroughs of tank and motorized divisions located on the far edges of the 800-kilometer front from Kalinin to Tula, stubbornly drove their flank groups forward, no matter what. And those, coming across the echeloned and counterattacking defense of the Russians, bled more and lost their penetrating ability. At the same time, the Germans were unable to organize an offensive in the center of the front. And this, as Zhukov writes, gave us the opportunity to freely transfer all reserves, including divisional ones, from passive sectors, from the center to the flanks, and direct them against the enemy's strike groups. So, the southern group of Guderian, 2nd Tank and 2nd Field Armies, unable to break through the defensive shield of Tula, rushed around it from the southeast to Kolomna and Kashira, broke into Stalinogorsk, now Novomoskovsk, threatening a breakthrough towards Venev and Kashira. But the Soviet command managed to transfer several rifle and tank units there. Unexpectedly for themselves, the Germans first encountered their stubborn resistance. And then they were pushed back to the Mordvets area by a counterattack by Belov's Cavalry Corps and Hetman's Tank Division. When Guderian made a stubborn attempt to bypass the cursed Tula from the northeast and even cut the Sapukov-Moscow railways and highways, he was again thrown back to the line of Tula by a sudden counterattack of the 50th, which he allegedly defeated and captured a month ago. Nodal, Don. Red Army soldiers are considering captured weapons. Tula area, December 1941. German cannon abandoned during the retreat near Tula. December 1941. It was here that Guderian's panzer wedges faced opposition from Soviet T-34 tanks. About these battles, he later wrote, our 37mm anti-tank guns turned out to be powerless against Russian T-34 tanks. It came to a panic that engulfed the sector of the front to Bogoroditsk. This panic, which arose for the first time since the beginning of the Russian campaign, was a serious warning indicating that our infantry had exhausted its combat capability and was no longer capable of major efforts. And Halder recorded in his diary in early December, the situation in the 2nd Army Zone is critical, and its command has failed. In a couple of weeks, Guderian's military career will also collapse. At the end of November, the situation at the front near Moscow continued to heat up. On November 23, the 3rd and 4th German panzer groups broke into Klin and Solnechnogorsk and, having struck from here at Yakroma and Krasnaya Polyana, found themselves only 20 kilometers from Moscow. On November 28, having crossed the ice of the Moscow-Volga Canal, the Germans captured the bridge and a small bridgehead. They approached Moscow for a direct shot from long-range guns, and delivered them. Zhukov, at the utmost risk, literally exposed the passive sectors of the front, transferred rifle, tank units and artillery to breakthroughs, even separate groups with anti-tank grenades and anti-tank rifle squads. The blow of the 1st Shock Army, advanced by order of the headquarters, together with the 16th and 20th Armies of the Western Front, the Germans were driven back from the canal. In Krasnaya Polyana, the troops of the 16th Rokossovsky captured 2 super heavy guns that never had time to shoot at Moscow. The battle has come to a turning point. It seemed that the string stretched to the limit was about to burst, the front would not withstand, and the Germans would break into Moscow. Alarmed, Stalin called Zhukov one night. Are you sure that we will keep Moscow? I ask you this with pain in my soul. Speak honestly like a communist. Zhukov, looking at the map lying on the table, answered firmly. Moscow, of course, we will keep. But we need at least 2 armies and at least 200 tanks, Stalin said with satisfaction. It's good that you have such confidence. Call the general staff and agree on where to concentrate the 2 reserve armies that you ask. They will be ready by the end of November, but we cannot provide tanks yet. German 150mm howitzer K-39, abandoned during the retreat near Tula. December 1941. By the beginning of December, the strong-willed and persistent implementation of the operational tactical countermaneuver by Zhukov and the army commanders began to bear fruit. Von Bock and his generals rushed about. German troops were at the limit of their capabilities. As early as November 22, Halder stated, the troops are completely exhausted and incapable of an offensive. Von Bock compares the current situation with the situation of the battle on the Marne in 1918, indicating that a situation has arisen when the last battalion abandoned can decide the outcome of the battle. Realizing the impossibility of breaking through armor and wheels on the flanks, the German generals decided on December 1 to break through in the center in the area north and south of Nerofominsk. But even here they were hit by counterattacks from the 33rd Efremov and 5th Govorov armies. Having lost more than 50 tanks in the battles near Kubinka, Akilov and Burtsev, the Germans rolled back. This was the last gust of the typhoon. The former Chief of Staff of the 3rd Panzer Group, K. Wagner, subsequently wrote, until 5.12, in all sectors of the front, the troops suspended the offensive on their own, without an order from above. The Red Army won the defensive battle, the German strike groups were exhausted and bled. In just 20 days of the assault, from November 16 to December 5, the Germans lost more than 155,000 people, 800 tanks, 300 guns and mortars, and many other equipment. The hope of the German commanders for crushing flank tank wedges did not materialize. The decision of the Soviet commanders, primarily on the Western Front, to repulse the assault on their own and keep reserves for a decisive counteroffensive turned out to be correct. The failure of Operation Typhoon was Germany's biggest military and political defeat. Now, as Blumentritt, the Chief of Staff of the Fourth Army, wrote, even at Hitler's headquarters they suddenly realized that the war in Russia, in fact, was just beginning. Counteroffensive. The collapse of the Blitzkrieg. By the beginning of the counteroffensive, the situation on the Soviet-German front was developing as follows. There was already a turning point on the northern, Leningrad, and southern, Rostov, flanks, and from mid-November to December 5, the strategic initiative gradually passed to the Soviet armed forces. The Germans, who in early November tried to open their way to the Caucasus with a strike on Rostov, were pushed back further than their original positions by the 29th, and Kleist's 1st Panzer Army suffered a serious defeat there. At the same time, near Tikhvin and Volkhov, the strike force of the 16th German Army, which was trying to connect with the Finnish troops and finally blockade Leningrad, also suffered a heavy defeat under the blows of our troops. These counteroffensives successfully completed a twofold task. They defeated the groupings that threatened Leningrad and Rostov and did not allow the Germans to transfer a single division to Moscow. For the third time in the 1941 campaign of the year, the moment of making the most difficult decisions comes for both the supreme commands and the commands of the fronts. The German leadership failed to achieve any of the goals of the Barbarossa Plan. Transportation of a German gun captured near Tula. December 1941. German truck Opel KFZ.305, shot down and abandoned during the retreat near Tula. December 1941. German 105mm FH-18-40 howitzer captured near Tula. December 1941. The active defense of the Red Army forced the Germans to stop all offensive operations, with the exception of the Moscow direction, where they still hoped to succeed. But the condition of the troops of Army Group Center was constantly deteriorating. Losses in people and military equipment were huge. In infantry companies the number fell to 60 to 40 people. The troops were completely unprepared for the winter, due to poor basing, lack of fuel and technical materials, the effectiveness of aviation, artillery, tank and motorized divisions. Under the influence of failures, the morale of the troops also deteriorated. For a significant part of the soldiers and officers, the initial victorious fuse was replaced by moods of uncertainty and doubt. The German leadership promised its troops an easy victory over a weak, semi-barbarian enemy and a quick end to the war. Soviet soldiers inspect the truck, Horch, abandoned by the Germans near Tula. December 1941. Self-confidence and underestimation of the enemy played an insidious joke with the German generals. Just on the eve of the transition of the Soviet troops to the counteroffensive, German intelligence reported to Hitler, the Russian forces do not allow them to go on a major offensive without significant reinforcements. The Soviet command so skillfully and covertly prepared and advanced the shock reserves of the three fronts that the Germans did not notice them on their flanks until the last hour. During the defensive battles, Zhukov and the headquarters did not miss the main goal for a minute, to seize the moment, seize the initiative, and when the enemy exhausted his offensive capabilities, strike back. Von Bock introduced more and more reserves. But the last battalions burned one by one in the Russian snows. The front of his armies was stretched out, his forces were weakening more and more. Gopner and Guderian ran out of steam, began to rush along the front in search of weak points, and the time came to strike them with a sudden retaliatory strike with fresh reserve armies. 57mm ZIS Z0 self-propelled gun based on the T-20 Komsomolets tractor. Western Front, Winter 1941-42. On November 29, Zhukov concluded, the enemy had exhausted his possibilities, the moment was approaching. He reported the situation to Stalin and requested that the order be given to launch a counter-offensive. After listening to the report, Stalin asked, "Are you sure that the enemy has approached a crisis state and does not have the opportunity to bring any new grouping into action?" Zhukov caught the well-founded doubts of Stalin, who understood well what price a mistake would cost in making such a pivotal decision prematurely or belatedly, and firmly replied, "The enemy is exhausted. But if we do not eliminate the dangerous enemy penetrations now, the Germans will be able to reinforce their troops in the Moscow region with large reserves at the expense of the northern and southern groupings of their troops, and then the situation may become seriously complicated." Stalin, after a short pause, said, "We will consult with the General Staff." On the evening of the same November 29, the headquarters made a decision and demanded to submit plans for the counter-offensives of the western, as well as the Kalinin, Kharkov, and southwestern, Timoshenko, fronts. The plan map of the western with red arrows of the army's strikes to a depth of 60 kilometers north and 100 kilometers south of Moscow was presented the next day, November 30. An explanatory note was attached to it, Archive of the USSR Ministry of Defense 16A, Op 947, File 36, Sheet 7072. German tanks of Czechoslovak production PZ, KPFW.35, T, were in service with the 6th Panzer Division, which reached Ikshia and Lobnya near Moscow. In terms of the counter-offensive, the shock groupings of the right, 16th and 1st Shock Armies, and left, 10th Army, flanks were assigned only the immediate task, by striking at Klin, Solnechny-Gorsk and in the Istra direction, defeat the main enemy grouping on the right wing and strike to Uzlovaya and Bogoroditsk to the flank and rear of the Guderian group to defeat the enemy on the left wing of the Western Front. The rest, 5th, 33rd, 43rd, 49th and 50th Armies, were tasked with pinning down the enemy forces and depriving him of the possibility of transferring troops. 2/3 of all aviation were to interact with the right, the rest, with the left groups. The beginning of the offensive, on the flanks, at dawn on December 3rd to 4th, the rest, on December 4th to 5th. In a personal note, Zhukov asked Vasilevsky to urgently report the plan to Stalin and give a directive, otherwise, preparations may be delayed. The idea of defeating the German grouping by the forces of the right and left wings of the Western Front was quite risky, because the offensive was undertaken in extremely difficult conditions. In November-December 1941, industrial production in the country was the lowest for the entire period of the war. The enterprises evacuated to the east could not provide the required amount of weapons and ammunition, and our troops suffered heavy losses in equipment in summer and autumn. It took a huge effort from the government headquarters to mobilize maximum forces and means. Machine gun crew in the snows of the Moscow region. Western Front, winter 1941-42. 3 armies, 1st Shock, 20th and 10th, 9 rifle and 2 cavalry divisions, 8 rifle and 6 tank brigades were transferred to the Western Front, but their equipment and training were low due to insufficient weapons and untrained troops. The headquarters also strengthened the Kalinin and southwestern fronts. Aviation was replenished with fighter and long-range bomber formations. As a result, the 3 fronts had 1,100,000 men, 7,652 guns and mortars, 415 PCs, 774 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft. The center group had 1,708,000 men, 13,500 guns and mortars, 1,170 tanks, and 615 aircraft. It surpassed all 3 Soviet fronts combined in people by 1.5 times, in artillery, by 1.8 times, in tanks, by 1.5 times, and only in aviation was inferior by 1.5 times. Zhukov, planning a counter-offensive with a shortage of weapons and an unfavorable balance of forces, was well aware of the full degree of risk he was taking. But the idea matured on the basis of a completely realistic assessment of the situation. At the same time, special calculation was made on a number of factors, the maximum use of which was supposed to bring success. The first is suddenness. Von Bock was sure that the Russians were almost defeated. They had no reserves for the offensive, and the remnants of the Red Army could only hold the defense near Moscow in winter. This delusion was to our advantage. But the Germans could see the light at any moment. Therefore, it was decided to reduce the pause for the transition of the Soviet troops from defense to offensive as much as possible or eliminate them altogether. Quickly and covertly prepare armies in the same bands and groupings, and advance new armies only at night, in a blizzard, snowfall, in non-flying weather, in order to make it difficult for them to be detected by German air reconnaissance. Second, The Germans in the offensive did not have prepared positions to repel oncoming attacks. Therefore, in the very first days, even hours, it is possible to decisively crush their front lines, not to let them sit on the defensive, in trenches, bunkers, fortified areas, or be closed by minefields. Breaking through will cost a lot of blood. Third, Von Bock's front is extended, there are no operational reserves. To parry attacks, he will transfer reinforcements from unattacked areas. This means that it is necessary to forestall him and thwart regroupings, although he will be pinned down by strikes on the flanks of the Kalinin and southwestern fronts. Fourth, the Germans are exhausted by the continuous offensive, their losses are great, they are not prepared for the winter, the supply is insufficient. Therefore, using the local superiority of Soviet aviation, destroy their rear bases, tear their lines of operations. German 75mm mountain gun Jeb G-36, abandoned during the retreat near Tula. December 1941. Together with the plan of the Western, which dealt the main blow, the plans of the Kalinin and southwestern fronts were approved with the following tasks. Kalinin, to strike at the 9th German Army, take Kalinin, go to the rear of the Klin group and, together with the Western, destroy it. Southwest, to defeat the Yelets grouping, go to the flank and rear of the 2nd Tank Guderian and, together with the West, defeat it. Thus, the Stavka's idea of a counterattack on 3 fronts was embodied in an integral plan for the defeat of the entire central enemy grouping along the 1,000-kilometer line from Kalinin to Yelets. The plan of the Western Front, as well as the plan of the Stavka as a whole, had characteristic features that are still the subject of discussion among historians. Only the immediate tasks were determined, and the subsequent ones were set and coordinated between the fronts during the counter-offensive. In the attack of a unit of the 1st Guards Motorized Rifle Division, the infantry is supported by T-40 light tanks. Moscow region, offensive area of the 33rd Army, December 1941. These features are explained by the limited forces and means available to the Stavka at that time. Zhukov testifies, we did not yet have the strength to set more distant and decisive goals for the troops at the front. We only tried to push the enemy as far as possible from Moscow and inflict as many losses on him as possible. And he also noted that, in our plans, there was still no clearly substantiated opinion that we were launching such a grandiose counter-offensive as it later turned out, no special order or general directive for the counter-offensive was given. Combat missions for the troops were set sequentially by separate directives of the front headquarters. The counter-offensive began on time. During the first 6 days, the advanced German divisions were defeated and points and areas of operational importance were captured. The Kalinin front began. His 29th and 31st Armies attacked at dawn on December 5 and, breaking the stubborn resistance of the Germans, broke through the defenses south of Kalinin. On December 6, the Western Armies attacked the enemy, on the right wing, the 1st Shock and 20th, on the left, the 10th, and on December 7 to 8, the 16th Army, P. Beloved's Task Force and the 50th Army. On the Yelets direction, from December 6 to 8, the 13th and 3rd Armies and the Group of F. Kostenko launched an offensive. Fierce battles unfolded along the entire front in the Kalinin, Klin, Solnechny-Gorsk, Istra, Tula and Yelets directions. The Germans, taken by surprise, tried to resist, but, unable to withstand the onslaught, were driven out, on December 8 from Kryakov, December 11 from Istra, December 12 from Solnechny-Gorsk. On December 9, the 30th Army broke through to the approaches to Klin. On the left wing, on December 10 to 11, Guderian was thrown back near Epiphan and Stalinogorsk, and rolled away from Tula. Soviet counter-offensive near Moscow on the right wing of the Western Front in December 1941. At former positions in cities and at stations, the Germans left thousands of dead, broken and abandoned tanks, guns, vehicles, warehouses and trains with ammunition and equipment. Until recently, the victorious German front was collapsing and retreating. What was the response decision of the German High Command? Everyone at Hitler's headquarters was stunned by the sudden Russian counteroffensive on the entire Central Front. Hitler did not want to believe the reports of the headquarters of the ground forces and the headquarters of the center group. He considered all these reports an exaggeration of frightened generals. According to his entourage, he was so amazed by the unexpected turn of events that he could not even perceive the very idea that the almost defeated Russians suddenly turned out to be stronger. At an urgent meeting on December 6, He angrily threw out his doubts to the leaders of the Wehrmacht. Even if the armed forces lost 25% of their strength, the Russians still suffered significantly greater losses in combat strength, and if our divisions hold sectors of 30 kilometers along the front, this indicates about the insufficient strength of the enemy. German half-track transporter SD, KFZ-11, abandoned near Tula. December 1941. But in the highest German headquarters there were also those who could not help but see the catastrophic situation of Army Group Center. In Halder's diary we read, "The most terrible thing is that the High Command does not understand the state of our troops and is busy patching up patches, while only making principled decisions can help the cause." One of the decisions of this kind should be the decision to withdraw the troops of Army Group Center to the Rus-Rostashkov line. On December 8, Hitler gave the order for a strategic defense. But even in it, he assessed the successes of the Russians as temporary, due to their greater adaptability to winter. Hitler stubbornly considered the defeat of the German troops an accident, noting in the order that the Russian troops were the worst, inferior in numbers, and that battles of this kind are won primarily by the strength of nerves, and this mainly concerns command. The Russians in this case proved the strength of their nerves. Further, the German troops were ordered not to take a single step back from their previous positions, to retreat only in the absence of ammunition. Light BT tanks arrived at the front from Siberia, from Irkutsk. On the near tank is the name of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, who died heroically in the defense of Moscow. Spring 1942. Such are the decisions of the Hitlerite High Command, taken in an extremely nervous atmosphere under the impression of the sudden collapse of plans. The generals ordered the units to fight to the last, but the most experienced of them were aware of the dead end and fatality for the troops of Hitler's decisions. The assessment of the situation by von Bock himself is striking in its hopelessness and gloominess. He believed that in the current situation it was pointless to demand from the troops not to take a single step back. In fact, it was impossible for Army Group Center to both retreat and conduct deterrent battles, because both led to heavy casualties. The thought involuntarily suggests itself, with such an assessment and mood, generals usually capitulate. The broken von Bock would later be removed from command by Hitler. The Soviet counteroffensive developed successfully on the flanks and in the center. For breakthroughs of the enemy front and pursuit, shock operational mobile groups were created as part of tank and cavalry formations. On the left wing, F. Kostenko's group and the 13th Army of the Southwestern Front broke into Yelets on December 13, and on December 16 they surrounded and destroyed the main forces of the German 34th Corps and pinned down part of the forces of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army. At the same time, the 10th and 50th Armies of the Western struck from the north, and Belove's group, 1st Cavalry Corps and Hetman's Panzer Division, broke into Stalinogorsk. On December 13, units of the 10th Army took Epiphan. The German 2nd Panzer Army, flanked north and south of Tula, fell into the Bag, its divisions suffered heavy losses, and Guderian hurried out of the Bag and rushed away from Moscow, throwing heavy weapons, vehicles, tanks and tractors. He never fulfilled his plan to bypass Moscow from the south. German truckman abandoned by the enemy during the retreat near Tula. December 1941. Tank Mk3, Valentine II, from the 136th Separate Tank Battalion of the Red Army on the outskirts of Rusa. During the 10 days of the offensive, the armies of the left wing advanced 130 kilometers, lifted the siege of Tula and reached the Staritsa-Mala-Yaroslavets-Kaluga line. The 10th Army drove the Germans out of Kaluga on December 30, 1941. The armies of the right wing of the western and left wing of the Kalinin fronts overturned the entire northern flank of Army Group Center. Von Bock feverishly regrouped the downed and disorganized troops. The 3rd and 4th Tank Groups, which suffered heavy losses, had to be brought together under the command of Gopner and assigned the task of holding the lines near Istra and Solnekhnegorsk until the last opportunity in order to prevent the Russians from capturing Klin, a major junction through which the main German forces. He sought to gain time to prepare defenses at the turn of the Lama and Rusa rivers. But the maneuver did not give significant results. Cars abandoned by the Germans near Tula. December 1941. Armored cars BA-20, BA-6 and BA-10 from the 112th Panzer Division of the Red Army. December 1941. Zhukov acted ahead of schedule. Under the onslaught of the 16th, 5th and 20th Armies, which took Istra, Lokotnya and Solnekhnegorsk, the combined Gopner group could not resist. And although the Germans, having blown up the dam of the Istra reservoir, tried to hold their positions, nothing came of it. Rokossovsky, with mobile groups of M. Kartukov and F. Ramazov, bypassed them from the flanks and, having knocked down strong field obstacles, advanced to the west. On December 15, the 1st Strike Kuznetsov and the 30th Liliashenko broke into Klin and defeated 2 motorized and 1 tank German divisions. At the same time, the 29th and 31st Armies of the Kalinin Front, having intercepted the German withdrawal routes, stormed Kalinin on December 16. The refusal of the German garrison to capitulate only cost the Germans more than 10,000 soldiers and officers killed. The defeat of the southern and especially the northern flank of the center group threw the German command into confusion and caused sharp disagreements among the generals. The events of mid-December are indicative. The commander-in-chief of the ground forces, Field Marshal V. Brauchitsch, flew to Smolensk on December 13. There, von Bock, revealing to him the real picture of the catastrophe, stated bluntly, to fight as before, apparently, he had in mind Hitler's order, means dooming the troops to complete annihilation. Brauchitsch on December 14, at a meeting with army commanders, was convinced of the inevitability of a retreat and, consequently, the collapse of the Blitzkrieg. It was necessary to withdraw the army at least to the Roosevelt-Staritsa line. The commanders of the BA-10 armored car and the T-34-76 tank are clarifying their combat mission. 1st Guards Tank Brigade, January 1942. Tanks T-34-76 from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade during the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow. Western Front, winter 1941-42. But he knew about Hitler's tenacity. Then Brauchitsch turned to Hitler's personal adjutant Schmundt, who was at the headquarters of the group, with a request to persuade the Führer to the desired decision. And on the morning of December 14, I received the necessary order. However, in the evening of the same day, Hitler reversed his decision. Hitler continued to hurl thunder and lightning at the heads of his generals. He still hoped for a change in the situation near Moscow and completely rejected the very idea of U-200B/U-200 retreating to the meridian of Vyazma for the winter. On December 16, he held a meeting with the leadership of the Wehrmacht and categorically demanded to hold the front to the last soldier. At the same meeting, Hitler decided to remove Brauchitsch, von Bock, Guderian and other generals from their posts as incapable of leading troops in crisis situations, and he himself took the post of commander-in-chief of the ground forces. By telephone, Hitler told his generals that if they began to retreat, the Russians would follow on their heels, and the German armies would not be able to stop. There are no prepared lines in the rear, and the words Napoleon's retreat will become a reality. A Soviet repair brigade inspects a PZ KPFW.3 tank left during the retreat by the Germans from the 10th Panzer Division. Western Front, January 1942. The remains of a German Bf-109 aircraft abandoned near Moscow during the retreat of the Army Group Center. Canaris, head of military intelligence, Abwehr, wrote, "The appalling consequences of our criminal underestimation of the enemy." Schmundt draws a parallel with 1812 and says that the moment of truth for National Socialism has arrived. The losses of weapons and equipment are enormous. Tanks, guns, aircraft are destroyed or abandoned. The admiral noted with fear, "Our treatment of Russian prisoners of war brought terrible consequences. The Bolsheviks are now reacting to the massacres and barbaric treatment of their comrades. Indeed, our fighters, entering the liberated cities and villages, saw the cruel traces of German domination." Coincidentally, it was on the night of December 16 that Zhukov gave the order to continue the offensive. Introduced into the breakthrough, the 2nd Cavalry Corps of Doveta, together with the 22nd Tank Brigade, broke into the area of Lake Trostenskoye and began to move towards the Ruza River. The armies of the center of the front also went on the offensive. On December 26, Narofominsk was taken. The 33rd and 43rd Armies, pursuing the enemy, reached the Prokva and Luzha rivers by the end of December and liberated Malyaroslavets on January 2, 1942, and Borovsk on January 4. The counteroffensive near Moscow was the first general offensive of the Soviet troops in the Great Patriotic War and was not without difficulties and miscalculations. Commanders of all ranks were just gaining offensive experience. Troops of the 33rd Army behind enemy lines. Western Front, January 1942. Soviet infantry passes by an abandoned German tank PZ, KPFW.2 Ausf.C. Moscow region, Solnechny-Gorsk region, December 1941. Reconnaissance group of the 354th Rifle Division in the liberated village of the Moscow region. The offensive area of the 16th Army, January 1942. The 150 mm German self-propelled gun SIG-33, SF, Auf BZ, KPFW.I Ausf.B. Captured by Soviet troops. Western Front, December 1941. Many were afraid to go for bold maneuvers, detours and coverage, deep breakthroughs. They were afraid to get surrounded, resorted to frontal attacks. Zhukov and the staff sharply pointed out these mistakes in directives and orders. For example, the directive of December 9, 1941 stated, "The practice of advancing and pursuing the enemy shows that some units are completely wrong in fighting, and instead of moving forward rapidly by bypassing the rearguard of the enemy, they are engaged in a protracted frontal battle with him. By order, it is categorically forbidden to conduct frontal battles with enemy covering units, to prohibit fighting against fortified positions, leaving small barriers against the rear guards and quickly bypassing them, going as deep as possible into the enemy's withdrawal path." Or from the directive to Commander 30D, Lilyashenko, "Strike with a dagger on a narrow front." By January 7 to 10, 1942, the offensive capabilities of the three fronts had dried up, the surprise factor had exhausted itself. The enemy managed to cling to a number of natural lines and organize a strong defense. With the fronts reaching the line Oreshki, Staritsa, Lama and Ruza, Maloyaroslavets, Kaluga, Mosulsk, Sukhinichi, Belev, Mtsensk, Novosil ended the first stage of the counter-offensive near Moscow. From this line, the general offensive of the Red Army began, which lasted from January to April 1942. Presentation of awards to servicemen of the 33rd Army. Soviet-German Front, Vyazma Region, February 1942. A column of German tanks BZ, KPFW.3 retreats from Moscow. December 1941. Conclusion. The battle near Moscow became the very decisive battle of the 1941 campaign, which the military-political leadership of Germany initially aspired to, starting a blitzkrieg against the USSR. And this battle ended with the defeat of the German troops. The Wehrmacht suffered heavy losses in men and equipment, and the German armies were pushed back from Moscow by 200 to 400 kilometers. But the main significance of this battle is not even in this. The victory of the Soviet troops near Moscow was the beginning of a turning point in World War II. Germany faced a real threat of a protracted, exhausting war, which the Nazi leadership did not count on. With a quick defeat of the USSR, Hitler intended to establish German hegemony in Europe and destroy the last hopes of England to find at least some support to continue the war with Germany. It turned out the opposite. England and the United States, which at first took a cautious and waiting position, watching the confrontation on the Eastern Front, now, having buried the stone deeper in their bosoms, finally decided to conclude an agreement with the USSR on alliance and war against Germany, drawn up in June 1942. And although Hitler quite reasonably regarded this alliance as unnatural, nevertheless, he received a powerful, anti-Hitler coalition and the prospect of a war on two fronts as opponents. Such is the strategic significance of our victory near Moscow. Staff cars KFZ.82, abandoned due to lack of fuel. December 1941. A column of T-34 76 tanks from the 17th Tank Brigade of the Red Army. December 1941. As for the operational tactical assessment of the Moscow battle, it should be noted that the Red Army won this first general battle of the war not by superior forces and means, and by no means by superior tactics. Soviet soldiers and officers surpassed the enemy in strength of mind, steadfastness and endurance, selflessness and the will to win, qualities that originate in the depths of the national Russian character. German strategists, in accordance with the doctrine of lightning war, made the main bet, and theoretically right, on the maneuverability and penetrating power of tank and mechanized formations combined into shock groups, on their ability to quickly break through the front, make detours and encirclements. But this strategy, which brought success in Western Europe, began to falter from the very first days of the war against the USSR. The armies of European states, after a deep breakthrough of their front by German tank wedges, no longer offered serious resistance, retreated or surrendered, considering the matter lost. In Russia, a completely different enemy appeared before the Germans. Already on June 29, 1941, the chief of the General Staff of the German Ground Forces wrote in his official diary, "Information from the front confirms that the Russians everywhere are fighting to the last man. The stubborn resistance of the Russians forces us to fight according to all the rules of our combat regulations." In Poland and in the West, we could allow ourselves certain liberties and deviations from the statutory principles, which is now unacceptable. And then the entry of July 20th, separate groups of the enemy, continuing to remain in our rear, are a real disaster for us. Broken German equipment in one of the cities of the Moscow region. Western Front, January 1942. Soviet troops did not immediately find ways to effectively counter the strategy and tactics of the German generals. Of course, the War of Engines was not a novelty for our military leaders, but the real training of the Red Army officer corps for it and the technical equipment of the Soviet troops in 1941 were not up to paragraph. On the other hand, the Germans, inspired by successes in the West, began to exaggerate the strength of their mobile troops and clearly underestimated the capabilities and skill of their Russian enemy. Since the beginning of the war, they routinely resorted to the same operational tactical method of deep tank mechanized breakthroughs with subsequent flank bypasses. The German tactics had an obvious success while the Russians were lost at the sight of the German tanks breaking through and ran from them. But by the fall of 1941, an increasing number of Soviet officers and soldiers realized that it was possible and necessary, by all means, to fight and win, even standing on one knee. A clear example of this is a breakthrough from the encirclement of the inverted Bryansk front or the defense of Tula. And here it is also important to note that, despite the catastrophe near Vyazma in October 1941, the spirit of combat resistance of the Soviet troops not only was not broken, but constantly increased. In November and early December, the Germans continued to advance and approached Moscow at 20 to 30 kilometers, but they could no longer make impressive breakthroughs or significant encirclements. Figuratively speaking, during this period the Germans were no longer so much developing their success as more and more compressing the invisible spring. In December their strength dried up, the spring broke and dealt them a crushing retaliatory blow. In more military terms, the armored and mobile units of the Wehrmacht still continued to break through our defenses, but in the face of increased resistance from the Soviet troops, the German generals were unable to support their strike groups with enough infantry reserves, which would consolidate the success. An Operation Typhoon, victorious at its beginning, turned into a defeat for the Germans. In contrast, the Soviet command in the Battle of Moscow was able to counter the German, fast war of engines with the tactics of exhausting war of reserves, and ultimately won a decisive victory. Having bled the enemy with active defense, the Soviet command gained time and managed to prepare forces for a retaliatory strike. A quick, without the usual pause, the transition to a counterattack on the still attacking enemy, when he did not expect a counter-strike, played a decisive role in achieving victory. Such a turn of the situation in their favor indicates that Soviet military leaders have gained experience in conducting large-scale defensive and offensive operations. The plan for the further offensive of the Soviet troops near Moscow, carried out from January to May 1941, an outstanding role in organizing the defense and choosing the moment of the counterattack, no doubt, belongs to G.K. Zhukov. Stalin, as the supreme commander, also showed exemplary firmness and endurance, doing a great job of preparing reserves and maintaining them until the right moment. Not Hitler's mistakes, not the autumn thaw and not the harsh winter were the main reasons for the defeat of the German troops near Moscow, although, of course, all this had a certain significance. But more than 1 million German grouping was crushed here against the iron stamina of the Soviet troops, behind which stood the Russian people, determined to fight for their fatherland until victory. Impeccably thinking German strategists, however, lost sight of one important factor which General Jodl remembered after the war. When asked about the reasons for the defeat of Germany, he replied, "Starting a war with Russia, we, of course, knew the approximate number of divisions, tanks, aircraft, but we did not know the Russian soldier. To the blessed memory of those who stood to the death, but did not let the enemy to Moscow." Photos from the collection of I. Meshinsky and the archive of the Publishing Center, Exprint. Illustrations. Armored Car BA-10 from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade. Western Front, December 1941. Armored Car BA-20M from the 112th Tank Division of the Red Army. Western Front, December 1941. 150mm self-propelled gun on a mobile carriage SIG-33 Alf PZ, KPFW. IAUS B from the 10th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. Army Group Center, November 1941. Armored car of the French production Panhard 178 from the 7th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. Army Group Center. English-made tank Mk2 Matilda II from the 132nd Separate Tank Battalion of the Red Army. Northwestern Front, January 1942. English-made tank Mk3 Valentine II from the 136th Separate Tank Battalion of the Red Army. Western Front, December 1941. T-34-76 from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade in winter protective deforming camouflage. Western Front, January 1942. Medium tank PZ, KPFW.4 Ausf.E from the 20th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. December 1941. Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. Leave a review about the book, http://royalib.com/comment/bylinin_sergey/bidva_za_moskevu.html. All books by the author, http://royalib.com/author/bylinin_sergey.html.